Good. I think we're ready to go. So welcome to SDU, Giovanni, and welcome everyone to HEDG Hosts, a series of events run by the Historical Economics and Development Group at the University of Southern Denmark, where we invite some of the most incisive writers and thinkers inside and outside academia to present their work and demonstrate the relevance and continued impact of historical developments on contemporary societies. Today, we are delighted to welcome Professor Giovanni Federico from New York University, Abu Dhabi. Giovanni is an economic historian and started his academic career studying modern Italian economic growth. Later, he developed an interest in global and comparative history. He has published many important articles and books on economic history, and he is currently editor of the Economic History Review. He has built with Antonio Tena from Carlos III in Madrid the Federico Tena World Trade Historical Database, and has now moved on to a new research project on world population. We look forward to hearing about this new work today. So a small practical matter, since HEDG Hosts are recorded for our YouTube channel, please do not interrupt the talk, okay? So don't say anything. There will be plenty of time for questions after Giovanni's talk. And over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me here. And basically, as Paul was saying a moment ago, I am not a professional demographer. I am an economic historian, and I came to this strange puzzle I will try to discuss with you today in a strange way, because Antonio insisted that export per capita could be a good measure of openness of economies when we do not have GDP data, which means for 2/3 of the 3/4 of countries in history. And so we started to look for data for population, and we discovered that there is no data on population. So basically, the key problem, the debate on historical demography now is a very hot topic in economics, and there are basically three strands of literature. One, there is a large number of tests whether pre-industrial European economies are Malthusian or not. Then there is a small but quite fast-growing series of work testing the unified growth theory, which I will return in a moment. Of course, people know here very well, but for, which is a basic idea about Gallor, about how economic growth developed, which has a strong implication for demography. And then, of course, in the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a huge debate about COVID and about Spanish flu as an example of big pandemics. And so we had quite a large number of works about COVID and about intervention to COVID. So basically, economists are very interested in the demographic data and demographic development. And okay, the other way around, I will learn sooner or later. The key problem is that all this data, most of it has been done with extremely limited amount of data. So what we have is a long-run series for a few European countries. The only really the couple of long-term series, the series which everyone has been working has been for England from 1541 by Riley and Schofield. Nothing else in terms of vital statistics until the me, but without watching the slide.
Now the lights are sharing again because I can see it on my computer. Right?
Okay.
So now it's fine. It keeps disappearing again.
Okay. Anyway, so basically there is we know a lot about English demography. We do not know anything or very little about Chinese demography. China has about 1/3 of the world population. the key question I'm going to speak today is population has been growing from about 1 billion people in 1800 to 2.2 billion people in 1938. So it's been more than doubled. This is the rate of growth with smoothed with kernel. The 2 points is that first you have 2 clear crises. This you already probably imagine is the Spanish flu and the war, and the Russian Revolution. And this, which is much worse, was the Taiping Civil War in China. The Taiping Civil War in China was the greatest demographic disaster since 1800, basically, in terms of, so without this, the population would have been growing steadily with the roughly accelerating rate of growth. One point which we found, at least I found a little bit surprising, is that when I started thinking, I was thinking in terms of Malthusian world. So basically high mortality rate, Western version is high mortality rate, high fertility. Chinese version tends to have been low fertility, low mortality, but both cases, low population growth. And yet, I found that in many areas, population has been growing quite fast, even at the beginning, 19th century in Europe has been growing quite fast, also in 18th century. So this is the question I'm trying to address today. Why has been this growth? Some other simple oops. Yeah. I pushed the, oh, this is okay, sorry, but okay, this is the division by continent. We have been using in the paper a more refined division 18 demographic areas because so basically, for instance, in Americas, it's North, United States, then there is the South, there is Caribbean, which has totally different demographic history, and the immigration Latin America, which is Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and then the other Latin America, because continents are not the really good geographic area if you look at population movement. But this is for continent. In the paper, you have also the division within continents. Basically, there is a decline of share of Asia, an increase of the share of Europe until the war and the Spanish flu, and a very fast increase of the Americas, because the Americas got a huge amount of large number of immigrants, and basically a decline in Africa as well. Especially at the beginning, Africa, in the late 19th century, African population was decreasing. Oops. Other standard fact, volatility of population. So this is our residuals from Hodge-Prescott filter. There are other measures of volatility in the paper, but just to give you an idea, basically, there is not clear decline in volatility. And of course, there are some big shocks, but if you we have done some econometric estimates in the next slide, and you have had a lot of crisis years. This is the black dotted line is the number of polities which have a crisis, which we define as an absolute decline in population, because otherwise it would be impossible to have excess death or some more refined measure. And the red line is the percentage of these policies on total world population. So you have clearly the peak of the Spanish flu, And the big peak in Taiping, there are not very many countries which experience a decline in population, but they accounted for a large share of world population, because China accounted for about a third of the world population. At the beginning, you have plenty of African and Oceanian areas which experience a long-term decline in population for diseases, and then the number shrinks. So just to sum up the stylized facts, finally, a small exercise. This is the black line, is our basic series of population. And then you have a counterfactual. The red line of counterfactual is without the Taiping crisis. So if Chinese population had been growing as much as before the crisis, and the gray line is basically without the World War I and the Spanish flu. Basically, so the key point is that the Taiping crisis had much bigger impact than the World War I and Spanish flu. So basically, if both of them, there's data, more precise data on the paper, but without them, population would have been about 300 million more in 1938 than actually had been. The best, okay, there is a next slide. So basically, that is facts, population grew, distribution by continent changed. The volatility of population did not decline. We have done with economic analysis with two different measures: the standard, the residual Prescott, the Hamilton measure, which is now considered a standard by economists. I'm not very convinced, but I am not an expert. So basically, there is only one case where you have a downward trend in volatility, or meaning that there has been a clear decline in impact of mortality crisis, which is Europe before 1913. So the only case when you have also immigration of Latin America, but this is depends on immigration. The only area where mortality, volatility was declining, and so mortality crises were clearly declining, was Europe before 1913, and after 1913, what is increased by the peak of the Spanish flu. So crises were about 1/6 of the total observations. So you have an absolute decline in your population, so about 3. And there are short-term crises for famines, epidemics. There is a medium-term crisis of wars, and then in some cases, it appears there's been long-term decline, which has been basically concentrated in Africa and Oceania. Africa because of slave trade, or at least this is what Manning and Morten Jensen say, and Oceania because of diseases. So when the Europeans arrived, they brought diseases for which the natives had no immunity, and then natives died in large numbers. So there is a long discussion. By the way, Pacific Islands is the nightmare, because trying to estimate the series for all Pacific Islands, which are very many, is a little bit nightmarish. But anyway, and so the numbers, the Taiping War probably has something in terms of lost total deaths. The total lost decrease in population was about 80 million people, which is, I mean, from including of course the missing births during the period, and which was worse, much worse than the civil war, Spanish flu. the best estimates include ours is about 35 million, 40 million. The number of 100 million is totally crazy. It's a very strange story because it comes from a footnote, one famous estimate, saying that it might arrive to 100 million without any type of evidence. But of course, all historians jump to this number because it's big, but there is no clear evidence, probably the best evidence. Okay, and so basically, this is the main results. So basically, what is about the paper? This is just a big introduction about the paper. What is the paper is about? The paper is about to try to understand why population grew. And so at the first point, we have tried to date as well as we can. Of course, we have to admit that some series are not perfect, but we assume that that's the best we can do. And so we have done a very simple statistical testing. So taking this series, we are aggregating 18 areas, as you were saying, otherwise it would be a nightmare to do. And we are trying to find structural breaks with the standard bipair structural test for series. And then with a little bit of, we're trying to find the more plausible breaks, which means that they have a narrow interval of confidence. The statistical procedure gives an interval of wider. So we have got intervals of 3 or 4 years, and looking at the series when there is clearly the breaks do not correspond to some demographic crisis. So there is not a rebound after the Taiping War, just for example, things like that. And then when we have selected this data, we have estimated rate of growth of population. So we have, let's say, in North Africa, our best estimate 1876, and basically we estimate the rate of change before 1876, and then from 1876 to the next break, which can be 1938 if you don't find another break. So how looks the first the standardized fact of this transition? So first point, in the long term, in all areas, there is a growth of population, except Pacific Islands. Pacific Islands had this very bad initial period when population was collapsing. And so even if they have started to grow in the 1920s, basically in the long run, the late growth has not been sufficient to change. In all areas, we have one clear break, which is followed by an increase in the rate of growth. This is, I will show in a moment the dates, but basically in Europe is 18th century, basically is Europe is 70-30, if I rightly remember, Western Europe, and so on, but in all other areas in our period. Before the break, as I was telling before, there is in many areas there is significant population growth, significant in statistical sense, so meaning that rate of growth is significantly different from zero, and also significant in demographic terms. So we have plenty of areas which have population growth more than 5 over 1,000. Basically, this is already something which a little bit strange if you think to the conventional models of transition, because all conventional models assume that we start from a Malthusian world with zero population growth. So basically not in all, but and after 50 break there is everywhere acceleration, in population growth. So basically, you can date a period of faster growth, which started a specific date. Of course, we are not pretending that our dates are perfect, but just broad ideas. And except in North America. North America was growing, population apparently was growing very fast since the beginning, since the 18th century. Of course, it was attracting a lot of immigrants. And then some series, there is a second break, which usually corresponds to an acceleration of growth of world population. So basically, summing up, there is a strong evidence of upward stage growth, so the start of the demographic transition. As you know, there is plenty of data of work about the end of the demographic transition now, and of course we are not dealing with this literature because you cannot bring much information. We are trying to focus the start. My word was Methuselah, I don't know, and some doubt. And we would have liked to use the same approach today, the whole process of transition with the data from the United Nations. We have the data from the United Nations after 1950, but it's tricky. We tried to do some statistical analysis, but we did not present in the paper because we have this break from 1938 to 1950, and so we cannot date what happens that period. And so basically, here, the last part of the talk will be about the focus on the early stage. So first, when this population growth started and why. When we are quite sure, at least we have a good story. Why? I'm not so sure. When, this is the upper of the bracket, so this is the 18 areas. Between brackets is less, the data are less say, clear, but basically you can see that you have mostly in the 19th century, only China and the Pacific Islands are in the 20th century. This means that if you look at the conventional dating, actually there are a couple, one old paper by Riley in 2005, and a more recent paper by Delvent et al., which is not yet published. Basically, this is much earlier. And that's why the big problem, because all the possible causes, which I'm trying now to discuss, are very plausible for the late 19th century or 20th century. The problem is how to explain what happened in India in the late 1873, or in China after 1925. Okay, so models. This is extremely simple. Basically, we have two models of explaining transition, explaining the population growth. One is the standard transition model, which has been put forward by demographers, then by Becker long ago. And so the standard model, which I've been teaching to my students until a few days ago, is that you have exogenous decline in mortality, mostly probably infant and child, and then after some time, the household realized that there's no need to have a lot of children because a lot of them survive, and so reduce fertility. So you have a gap, we have decline in mortality, still high fertility, and population growth. Unified growth theory, which is not about demography, but this has a big demographic component, basically says that growth starts, and when growth starts, it starts a virtuous circle which includes also an increase in fertility. Basically, people have more money, have more children, population increase fosters technical progress. I would add Smithian growth, but Gallor do not quote it, but I mean, there's another possible explanation. And so basically, mortality remain high or maybe decline, but fertility increase because people are richer. At a certain point in time, technical progress change the demand for skills, increase demand for skills, and then when people start to realize that rather than having a lot of children who are educated, it's better to have fewer children but educate them. And so the fertility declines. And so basically, eventually households reduce fertility, but in the meanwhile, population grows. So basically, you have these two views, which have extremely the most simplified graph is this one, so the standard model. The orange line is birth rate, the blue line is death rate declines, birth rates remain high, then start to decline, and the meanwhile population rate of growth is a rate of growth peaks when the gap between the two is the largest. United growth theory assumes that fertility increases, mortality remains stable, and then declines, and the peak is when fertility. Of course, it's possible to have a decline here as well, and then in the case, the peak will be higher. The key problem is that distinguishing between these two models would be easy if you have birth and death rates, but we do not have birth and death rates, except for European countries, until basically the 1950s. Just to give, and so basically from the point we have population data, but population data basically cannot be distinguished in both models imply an increase in the rate of growth of population. Just to give you an example, this is the longest series in vital statistics, which is England from 1541. Here is 38, but basically after is just narrowing the gap. This is Italy from center North Italy until 1862, and then the whole of Italy. So basically, is it quite clear that, especially in England, fertility has been growing and has pulled most of the growth of population. The same happens also in Italy, less clearly, but still you have an increase in fertility. So basically, Y means that both from theoretical point of view and from empirical point of view, you have in the paper, you have a table with what is possible to get from European countries for which we have the data. And so basically, England and certain North Italy have fertility increase earlier, France decline. There is Sweden, Scandinavian country, probably both there is a gap, diverging gap, so basically increasing fertility and declining mortality. Okay, I forgot to write Germany. Germany is the only country, it's just a very recent work by Pfister, the only country which is more similar to the standard model. So you have first decline mortality and then fertility. Rest of the world is nothing comparable. Thus, scatter evidence that mortality remained high in the 19th century. So Russian mortality remained extremely high until the early 20th century, basically. But population was growing, and so if population was growing, you must assume that there's increase in birth rates, which mortality remained high. Okay, so why? So I'm closing with some hypotheses. If you have any suggestion, I would be more than happy. So let's start simple growth, economic growth. So if you have economic growth, you have a well-known relation between decline in mortality and GDP. So this is called Preston curve, which is a very old work by Preston in 1975, has been redone by Martin, by Prados, very recently, not yet published. The idea is that you have a negative relation between mortality and fertility and the GDP per capita, which is not linear. So you have a lot of gains at the beginning of economic growth in terms of decline in mortality, not that much when you increase GDP over a certain level. And there are plenty of ideas about mechanisms which relate the two. First, increase in agricultural productivity, you have more food. This is basically the Vogel story. Vogel, the last work by Vogel were about this increase in land productivity, which bring better health, more stronger, higher productivity. You have market integration. Market integration can reduce mortality crisis because either for public relief or because of market mechanisms, people bring food where the price is very high because there is a decline. And you have larger and better houses. So less overcrowded, you have less diseases, and you can buy investment in sanitation. So everyone says that sewers and aqueducts are very helpful because for preventing infectious diseases. And so when you're rich, you can build aqueducts. When you are poor or rural, it's much more difficult. The relation between fertility and GDP, the econometric evidence is less strong. So you have plenty of tests of Malthusian models in early modern Europe. The Malthusian model posits a positive relation between wages or GDP per capita and fertility. This has been confirmed by England, by most of the data. It's not clear whether it's confirmed for Central North Italy, because there are conflicting points, but anyway, there is GDP variables are often used as controls in other works. So most of the unified growth theory needs a negative relation between education or technical progress and fertility. This is the explanation of fertility in UGT is this one. So some works in this literature use GDP as a control, and there are some results which are not quite clear. So Martin and Marshall for France find significant positive coefficient. Martin and Strulik not, but anyway. The key point is that I believe that fertility is related to GDP growth because for a very simple theoretical model reasoning. Children are normal goods. If you're richer in Malthusian, post-Malthusian world, you are going to have more children, basically. So basically, so far so good. So the question is that when you have increased GDP per capita, you can explain quite easily population growth. No problem. The question is that population growth started before the start of modern economic growth. The only case where you have clearly a coincidence between start of modern economic growth, or GDP, increase in GDP per capita, and increase in population, according to our data, is England. But England is England. In all other countries, so China, India, Russia, you have population growth with stagnating or declining GDP per capita. And actually, there is people, there is a management in Italy who saying that the increase in population causes decline in GDP. So it's a Malthusian word, it's a carry Malthusian. And so basically, you cannot say UGT is right, that does not explain much. And here is the data we have tried to figure out from the Madison database, which is clearly not very accurate for most of the world, except the usual suspects. So these are some of the areas which we have where it's possible to make an estimate. And so the blue line, the blue bar, is the rate of growth before the start. The start is different according to our computation. The orange line is the rate of growth in the third year after our start of population growth. And the gray line is when from the start to 1938, which can be a very long period of time. And so basically you can see that in some cases you have an increase, in some cases not. For instance, in China, rate of growth declined, Eastern Europe, no change, so basically. But anyway, rate of growth after the transition, with the exception of Australia, New Zealand, and Caribbean, were very low. Of course, we know that there's not been much modern economic growth outside Western Europe, United States, Japan, before 1950. So the puzzle remains. They have some ideas. Okay. I repeat, the puzzle is that we need to find a cause of population growth which is not strictly related to, not a consequence of modern economic growth, of economic growth of GDP. Because if you have economic growth of GDP, the puzzle does not exist. Mortality, well, you have progress in medicine. So we have something exogenous relative to economic growth. Progress in medicine, well, drugs, the first drugs which were very effective were the sulfa drugs and antibiotics, which is 1930s. Sulfa drugs, antibiotics, 1950s, after 1950s. In fact, one of the big reasons of the boom of population boom after 1950s, 1960s, was the spread of modern medicine in the third world. But it did not exist in modern medicine before 1938. There was a germ theory. So the idea, this was a couple of people told me when I was playing, oh yes, but people started to know that you have to wash your hands. But wash your hands first need a germ theory. Germ theory that there is germs which you can get rid of by washing your hands, and is late 19th century. So Pasteur and Koch. And so we are speaking about early 19th century. And second, you need water, because it's easy if you wash your hands in a basin in your bathroom. But if you have to go and take the water out of the well, it's not so simple. So I think that this is a very important decline in mortality in Europe and advanced countries. It's a large number of very good works about the wonderful effects of aqueducts and sewers, but this late 19th century in advanced countries. Smallpox vaccination was useful. spread the early 19th century, and even in poor countries. There's a paper about Indonesia, but yeah, okay, it reduced one cause of mortality, but did not cause a big decline. Then market integration. But yes, of course, it was 19th century, there is a large trend towards liberalization of trade of cereals, increase in shipping, improving shipping technology, decrease in shipping costs. Is 19th century. One point which is probably very important, even is difficult to measure, or at least difficult to measure with the standards I would like, which is the new crops. So the American crops, which is basically maize, potatoes, and cassava, basically are useful because they produce many more calories per unit of land. And so producing more calories, producing more food. And so there's a famous paper by Nan and Qiang, which I do not believe, but anyway, it's about the effect of potatoes on population in European population. So basically, it's possible to have some reasons, especially new crop in China. There has been system of granaries which might have reduced the volatility and reduced food prices, but yeah, okay. This is, but the problem, and now this last slide, is that we do not want to have only to explain the decline in mortality. The problem is two, sorry. First, there is no clear decline in volatility. So crises are still quite important, and all these cases implies market integration. The mind should act via reducing crisis. Second point is that the key point is that we have to explain the increase in fertility, not just the increase in mortality. In all these cases, causes, I mean, you can start to think in a complex way that more food makes it possible to have more children because you think that you'll be able to feed them, but it's a little bit complex way. Is there anything which can explain an increase in anything exogenous can explain an increase in fertility? Well, there are two European stories. One is the Industrial Revolution. You know, for non-economic historians, is an increase in labor supply, which happened in some European countries in the 17th, 18th century. And so people had worked more, especially women and children, and working more had a higher income, and so may have more children. Of course, this can be consistent. These people worked more in order to buy tropical goods, basically. So sugar and coffee, basically, and manufacture. This is consistent with stable GDP, because otherwise we are back to the GDP story, if we have an increase in labor share. Or total. We have a paper about that. Maybe some de-skilling technical progress during the Industrial Revolution. So people, they reverse UGT. So UGT says that you have technical progress is skill intensive, so you need quality children. It could be argued that in some areas, technical progress were de-skilling. There is a huge debate about Industrial Revolution about that. And if the technical progress is de-skilling, you might not need, you may have more children because you need not to invest in their education. But this is a very European specific. I don't think that the skill in technical progress has any explicative power in China. Land abundance. Basically, if you look at the world, Malthus was very European, because the only place in the world where land was limited were Western Europe and some areas of China and some areas of India. But in many other areas, you have very much abundant land, and I'm not so just speaking in Western settlement countries, but for instance, there has been a huge expansion of Russia. So Russians moved from, let's say, broadly speaking, from Moscow to Kiev and to the whole of Ukraine. And so basically, this fact that there was abundant land means that the Malthusian constraints were not as binding as, let's say, northern Italy. The question is that, yes, this is possible, but why not? Why in the 18th century and not why in 16th century or 15th century? Maybe there's been also in 15th century with a lot of data, but I mean, why in the 18th century? Well, because you needed the state protection. So Russians did not move to what is nowadays Ukraine freely, but it was some state policy. Especially what is important is that the Russian state was conquering these areas, exterminated the Tatars, pushing back the Turks, and so create an environment which was conducive to the settlement of people. And so maybe this, or you can also think to the change in income distribution. And change in income distribution, which is now very popular in economic history, so it's always better to put income distribution in a paper. And basically, the idea is that you have changes which favor more fertility at the two extreme of the distribution range. Either you have the rich, because the rich have more children, that is in pre-industrial societies. This is quite well established. And so if you have an income distribution which increases the number of rich households, not the income of the already existing rich households, you can have an increase in fertility, or the very poor. If there's a change in distribution with the same GDP per capita, which favors the poor, then you can see that before that, a lot of people were unable to afford to marry. After it, with a more equitable distribution, you can have more marriages and more children. Or children, or earlier marriages. For instance, in England, there has been a decline in the age of marriage. Okay, this is our ideas, basically, are quite tentative ideas. We do not have any, so far, any firm conclusion, and we are not planning any econometric testing because that would be impossible with the available data. But I mean, if you have any questions or suggestions, would be more than welcome. Thank you.